Colorado. Autumn 1888. The guard dragged the old man out of the mud and shoved him toward the mine entrance. A woman pushed through and blocked their path, voice shaking but steady. "My father has already given you enough." Nobody moved until a stranger stepped forward, looked the most powerful man in Red Hollow dead in the eye, and said exactly one word: "Enough. Follow now and find out what one word can change." The rain had been falling since morning. Willa Hartwell sat on the bench of a freight wagon, her coat soaked through at the shoulders, her traveling bag wedged between her boots. The driver had stopped talking an hour ago. She didn't mind. She had been watching the mountains close in around the road, gray and cold, the kind of gray that made everything feel smaller. Red Hollow appeared slowly. First a chimney, then a row of low buildings pressed against the hillside. Then the mine itself, a dark mouth cut into the rock, with timber bracing on both sides, and a slack cable running overhead. Men moved around the yard below it, bent at the shoulders, moving like they'd forgotten what it felt like to stand straight. The wagon rolled to a stop near the yard gate. Willa climbed down before the driver offered to help. She saw her father immediately. Amos Hartwell was on his knees in the mud beside the mine entrance. He had one hand pressed flat against the wooden gate post, the other against his chest. A guard stood over him, saying something, gesturing toward the mine. Amos shook his head. His lips were moving. He was trying to stand. "Papa." She was already moving. She reached him before the guard noticed her. She crouched and got her arm under his, and he looked up at her with eyes that were wet from more than just rain. "Willa," his voice was barely there. "You came." "Of course I came." She helped him sit back against the post. He was thinner than she remembered. His cheeks had hollowed out. His breathing was wrong, shallow and quick, like a man who had learned to take small sips of air because bigger ones hurt. The guard stepped forward. "He's due underground. He can barely sit upright." "That's not my concern." A woman in a dark coat pushed through from the edge of the yard. She had a leather bag over one arm and a no-nonsense look on her face. She knelt across from Willa without asking permission and pressed 2 fingers to the inside of Amos's wrist. "I'm Dr. Price," she said, not looking up. "He's been like this for 2 days, then. Why is he standing outside a mine?" Dr. Price didn't answer that. She didn't have to. The answer was 20 feet away, coming across the yard with 2 more guards behind him. Blaine Harrow was not a large man. He dressed well for a mining settlement, clean coat, polished boots, a hat with no mud on it. He walked like someone who had never once been asked to hurry. "Miss Hartwell," he said. He said it the way a man confirms an appointment. "I was told to expect you. Then you already know why I'm here. Your father owes 60 more days of labor." The agreement was very clear. Amos shook his head again. "I've worked every shift. The company book shows otherwise." Harrow glanced at him with the mild interest of someone checking a ledger entry. "There are outstanding medical charges. Housing, a missed shift in July. I was sick in July. You know that. Sick days aren't working days." Willa stood up. She was not tall, but she had learned a long time ago that height was not the same as standing firm. "I'd like to see that book," she said. "It's a company record, not available to family." "Then show it to Dr. Price. Dr. Price is here on sufferance." Harrow's tone was pleasant. That was the worst part of him. He was pleasant about everything. "Your father agreed to 100 days of labor in exchange for medical treatment and housing. He has not completed that agreement." "He has completed every shift," Willa said. "He told me so. He's been marking them." Harrow smiled. A man marking tally lines in a watch is not a legal record. At her feet, Amos reached into his coat and wrapped his fingers around the pocket watch on its chain. He didn't take it out. He just held it. Willa noticed. Dr. Price looked up from Amos's wrist. "Mr. Harrow, I need to be direct with you. This man cannot go underground today. His lungs are not. I appreciate your opinion." Harrow turned and nodded to the guard. "It's time." The guard stepped forward and closed his hand around Amos's arm. Willa moved between them. She didn't plan it. It simply happened one moment she was standing beside her father, and the next she was in front of him, one hand out, her voice coming up from somewhere below her ribs. My father counts the days. Her voice cracked at the edges but held. He has already given you enough. The yard went quiet, not because she was loud, because nobody had said that out loud before. The guard didn't move back, but he didn't move forward either. He looked at Harrow. Harrow looked at Willa, with something shifting behind his eyes, not anger yet, just reassessment. Then boots crossed the mud. Slow, unhurried steps. A man came around from the side of the wagon where a second freight rig was parked. Tall, lean, a worn leather vest over a cream shirt, a weathered black hat with rain beating off the brim. He stopped between Amos and the guard and faced Harrow. He said nothing for a moment, just looked. Then, quietly, enough. One word, not shouted, not dramatic. Just said the way a man says something he has decided to mean. Harrow's expression changed. Rourke, his medicines are in the wagon. The man Rourke kept his voice flat. Along with your winter dry goods order. I'll leave it in the yard, as usual. But not today. Not while you're doing this. You have a contract. I do. Rourke looked at the guard, still holding Amos's arm. The guard let go, and, you have a sick man in the mud, so I'll make this simple. He comes with me, she comes with me. You get your order when I know he's been seen by a doctor somewhere that isn't your company office. Harrow was quiet for a moment. Willa watched him decide not to make a scene. Not yet. You understand what this costs you, Harrow said. I expect I do. Your freight contract runs through the county. I have influence there. You probably do. Harrow studied him. Then he shifted his gaze to Willa, and it was a different kind of look, the look of a man who is categorizing a problem. Your father abandoned his labor agreement, he said. That will be on record. His debt was paid, Willa said. Harrow turned and walked back toward the company office. Rourke crouched beside Amos and helped him up without being asked. Without ceremony, just got one shoulder under his arm and stood slowly, so Amos didn't have to carry his own weight all at once. Dr. Price picked up her bag and followed. Willa stood there for another second, watching Harrow's back. Then she picked up her traveling bag from the mud where it had fallen and walked to the wagon. Rourke helped Amos up to the bench, then climbed to the driver's seat. Dr. Price sat on the far side. Willa climbed up and sat between them, still holding her bag against her chest. They drove out of the yard without looking back. Nobody said much for the first mile. The rain had softened to a drizzle. The road curved away from the mine and down through a stand of bare-limbed trees. Amos reached over and found Willa's hand. He held it the way he used to when she was small, and the world seemed bigger than both of them. Then his grip tightened. Willa. His voice was very low. Just for her. I'm here. Don't let Harrow take the watch. He pressed her fingers once, hard. It proves I was already free. She looked at him. He was staring straight ahead, his breathing still shallow, his free hand pressed flat over the pocket where the watch rested. She nodded. The wagon moved on. Behind them, the mine bell rang for the afternoon shift, flat and cold across the hollow. Somewhere in the yard, men moved toward the entrance, did what they were told. Not her father. Not today. The ranch sat a mile and a half outside Red Hollow, tucked against the base of a pine-covered ridge. It wasn't much to look at from the road: a low house, a large barn, two smaller outbuildings, and a corral where 4 horses stood with their backs to the wind. But it was dry, and it was away from Harrow, and right now those were the 2 things that mattered most. Amos made it as far as the porch steps before the coughing took him. It came hard and deep, the kind that bent him forward at the waist. Rourke was off the wagon before Willa could move. He got both hands on Amos's shoulders and held him steady, not pulling, just present until the fit passed. Inside, Dr. Price said. Rourke's bedroom was the first door off the hall. He gave it without being asked. He stripped the extra blankets from the chest at the foot of the bed and piled them on without comment, then stepped out and pulled the door halfway shut behind him. Dr. Price stayed inside with Amos. Willa stood in the hallway and listened to her father breathe. After a few minutes, she walked back to the main room. Rourke was at the wood stove, feeding it with split pine. He didn't look up. "Sit down if you want," he said. She didn't sit. She stood near the window and watched the drizzle come down over the corral. He set a tin cup of water on the table near her without making anything of it. She drank it. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. "I can pay for food and whatever medicine he needs. I don't have much, but I won't accept charity." She set the cup down. "And I won't stay somewhere. I'm not useful. I can cook, keep books, haul feed, whatever you need done." Rourke looked at her for a moment. His eyes were gray, steady, hard to read. "All right," he said. "That's it? You said what you needed to say. I'm agreeing to it." He went back to the stove. "You can leave whenever you choose. That goes for both of you." She wasn't sure what she'd expected him to say instead. Something harder to accept, maybe. She filed the exchange away and let it sit. Dr. Price came out after another half hour. She said Amos's lungs were inflamed from months of bad air. She said rest and warmth were the first priority. She said he would improve if he stayed out of the mine, and she said it plainly, like she wanted Willa to understand that the alternative had a shape to it. Willa thanked her and went in to sit with her father. Amos was awake. The room smelled like pine smoke and old leather. He was lying with one hand over his chest and the other resting at his side, and his eyes found her the moment she came through the door. "You should see the ranch," he said. "I'll see it when you're better. I mean it. Good horses." He paused to breathe. "He's a good man, Willa. Kept to himself, but good. You knew him before? Saw him around. Deliveries." Another pause. "He never cheated on a weight. That matters." She pulled the wooden chair up close to the bed. "Papa, I need to look at your company statement." "The paper Harrow gave you." He reached under the pillow and handed it to her. She hadn't even asked him to keep it close. He already had. She spread it across her knees. The numbers were careful, very careful, laid out in a clean hand that gave them the appearance of authority. She ran her eyes down the columns. Medical treatment, 40 days of labor. Housing, 20 days. She found the missed shift listed for July 14th. She found a second medical charge dated 3 weeks after. The first. She stopped there, went back, read it again. 2 charges, same treatment, different dates. She pressed her finger to the page and looked at her father. "Did Harrow's doctor treat you twice? Different visits?" "Once," Amos said. "Early on. 1 treatment, 1 recovery week." She folded the paper carefully. "Tell me about the watch." He reached into his coat, which was hanging over the bedpost, and held it out to her. She opened the case. The outside was plain silver, worn smooth along the edges. The inside of the lid was covered with small marks, scratched in rows of 10. She counted 4 complete rows and then a partial fifth, 107. "I marked every shift before I slept," Amos said. "I didn't miss one. The statement says you owe 60 more days. I know what the statement's." He looked at her steadily. "I know what I worked." She handed the watch back. He held it against his chest on top of his coat. She went out to find Rourke. He was in the barn, forking old hay out of a stall. She stood in the entrance and waited until he noticed her. "I'd like to use your table this evening," she said, "to work through some numbers. Help yourself. I also want to offer you something." She crossed her arms against the cold. "Dr. Price said your freight books are behind. I can see it in the way the entry dates are stacked. I'm a trained bookkeeper. I can have your accounts current inside 2 days." He stuck the pitchfork into the hay pile and leaned on the handle. "You looked at my freight books. They were on the desk in plain sight." I wasn't prying a pause. "What do you want for it?" "Access to your delivery records from the past 8 months, specifically any entries showing goods signed for by miners at Harrow's site." He was quiet for a moment. She waited. "All right," he said again. She went back inside, lit the lamp on the table, and opened her bag. She had paper, 2 pencils, and the folded company statement. She spread them out and began. The double charge was obvious once she'd written it out long form. The missed July shift was possible, but suspicious. Harrow had listed it as willful absence, But Amos had no history of missed shifts before or after. She wrote down every number that felt wrong and circled it. An hour later, Rourke came in from the barn and ate standing at the counter. He set a plate across from her without asking whether she was hungry. She ate without stopping work. "I found 2 charges for the same medical treatment," she said. He looked at the paper from across the table. "You sure? Different dates, identical description, same amount. That's not an accounting error. Someone wrote it in twice on purpose." He sat down then. He looked at the statement the way she had carefully, from the top, not jumping to conclusions. "There are others," he said finally. "Other workers with false charges. I hear things on deliveries. Men complain about numbers that don't add up. Nobody does anything. Because Harrow owns the housing and the store." She picked up her pencil. "How many men?" "More than a few." She wrote that down too. They sat there for a while. The fire in the stove cracked and settled. Rain tapped against the window. "Your freight records," she said. "Do you log when men sign for underground supplies? Date, name, and load weight." "Always. Then we can cross-check Harrow's shift records against your delivery signatures. If Amos signed for a load on a day Harrow says he was absent, that's evidence." Rourke got up, went to the desk in the corner, and came back with a ledger. He set it in front of her and returned to his side of the table. She opened it. His handwriting was plain and regular. The dates ran clean down the left margin. She found the July entries first. July 14th, Amos Hartwell. Underground lamp oil, 2 crates. Signature on receipt. She looked up. He was working on the day. Harrow called absent. Rourke said nothing. He didn't need to. She kept reading. She was still reading when she heard the horses in the corral shift and blow. Then hoofbeats on the road. She looked at the window too dark to see anything clearly, and then at Rourke. He was already standing. 2 riders stopped outside the gate. One of them called out, "Rourke. Harrow wants the old man back. Tonight if possible." Rourke went to the door and opened it. The cold came in with him. "He's under a doctor's care," Rourke said. "Come back with a legal order and I'll have a conversation. Come back without one, and I won't open this door." A pause from the riders. "Harrow won't like that answer." "I expect not." He waited until they turned and rode back toward the road. Then he came inside and closed the door and dropped the bar across it. He stood there a moment. "They'll be back," Willa said. "Probably." He looked at her papers on the table. "Keep working. I'll check the windows." She turned back to the ledger. She worked for another hour, maybe more. When she finally set down her pencil and rubbed her eyes, the house was quiet. Rourke had checked every window and settled in the chair near the door with his boots still on. She picked up the lamp and went to check on Amos. He was asleep. His breathing was easier. She stood in the doorway and watched his chest rise and fall, steady and slow, and she let herself feel it, the first full breath she'd taken since she stepped off that freight wagon. She went to her own bedroll, which Rourke had laid out near the stove without being asked. She was almost asleep when she heard it. The creak of a window, cold air on her face. She sat up. The bedroom door was open 2 inches. She got up and went in. The window over Amos's bed was pushed up 3 inches. The curtain moved in the draft. Amos was still asleep. She reached for his coat on the bedpost. She already knew what she'd find. The watch chain was there. The watch was gone. She stood in the cold air from the open window and stared at the empty chain, and something in her went very still and very clear. Harrow had sent those riders to the front door on purpose. Willa didn't wake Rourke until first light. She had spent the remaining dark hours sitting in the chair beside Amos's bed with the empty watch chain in her lap, turning things over. She wanted to be certain before she said anything. Certainty took time. When she came out of the bedroom, Rourke was already up. He had coffee on and was pulling on his vest at the door. She told him plainly. The window, the watch, the timing of the riders. He listened without interrupting. Harrow knew what was in it, she said. Or he suspected. Either way, he sent 2 men to your door so a third could come around the back. She held up the chain. He didn't take the statement. He took the watch specifically. Rourke turned the chain over in his hand once, then gave it back. What do you need to do? I need Mabel Quinn to show me her boarding house records. He poured 2 cups of coffee and handed her one. Mabel's cautious. Harrow can evict her on 30 days' notice. I know. I'll be careful about it. She told Amos about the watch before she left. She kept her voice steady when she did it. He took the news with his eyes closed, like a man absorbing a blow he'd half expected. The marks were only half the proof, he said quietly. She leaned forward. What do you mean? He was quiet for a moment. Truett Shaw signed a receipt when I finished the 100th day. The original agreement, the whole debt paid in full. Harrow asked me to return it. He opened his eyes. I didn't. I folded it very small and put it underneath the watch lining. She sat back. Amos. I knew he'd change the numbers eventually. His voice was low and even. I'd seen him do it to others, so I kept it. She thought about what that meant. The signed receipt was inside the watch. The watch was in Harrow's possession. All right, she said. Then we need to prove the accounts are false from the outside in, and we need to get the watch back. He nodded. She went to town. Rourke drove her as far as the edge of the settlement, then turned the wagon east toward his regular delivery route. He said he'd be back by midday. She said she'd be fine. He didn't argue, just drove. Mabel Quinn ran the company boarding house from a kitchen that smelled permanently of wood smoke and boiled beans. She was a heavy-set woman with close-cut gray hair and a way of looking at people like she was deciding whether they were worth the trouble. She decided on Willa in about 4 seconds. I know who you are, Mabel said. Amos's girl. He talked about you. Good things, I hope. Said you were stubborn as a post and twice as useful. She poured coffee without asking. Sit. Willa sat at the kitchen table and laid out what she knew: the double charge, the false missed shift, the missing days in the account. She kept her voice low, which wasn't difficult. The kitchen was empty at this hour, the miners already underground. Mabel listened. Her expression didn't change much, but her hands went still around her cup. I need to see your meal records, Willa said. From the past 8 months. I keep every entry. I know. That's why I'm here. Willa looked at her directly. I'm not asking you to testify against Harrow. I'm asking you to let me read a logbook. Mabel studied her. And if what's in the logbook ends up in front of someone official, then it ends up in front of someone official. But I won't put your name anywhere without your permission. A long pause. Mabel got up, went to the shelf above the dry goods cabinet, and pulled down a cloth-bound ledger. She set it on the table between them. I'll be in the next room if anyone knocks, she said. Then she walked out. Willa opened it. Mabel kept meticulous records. Every meal served was logged by date, by name, by whether the man was boarding house resident or day labor. The entries ran in neat columns that made cross-referencing simple. Willa turned to July 1st and began working forward. She found it inside 20 minutes, July 14th. Harrow's account statement listed that day as Amos's willful absence, but Mabel's book showed no meal served to Amos that day. He had been charged for boarding house housing, but he'd eaten nothing, which meant he hadn't been at the boarding house. He'd been underground. She kept going. August 3rd. The company statement showed a full housing charge. Mabel's book showed no evening meal served. Overnight underground shift. August 19th. Same pattern. She found 9 days in which Amos was charged for boarding house accommodations on nights when he was working the underground overnight rotation. 9 days of charges for a bed he wasn't sleeping in. She wrote every date down on her own paper, careful and precise. Then she went back further and looked at the medical charge. The original treatment was recorded in Mabel's book. She noted it because Amos had missed 4 days of meals during his recovery, and she'd adjusted the weekly food accounting to reflect it. 1 treatment, 4 missed meals. Recovery week clearly marked. The second charge on Harrow's statement had no corresponding gap in Mabel's records. Amos had been eating normally on those dates. He had not been recovering from a second treatment. He had never had a second treatment. She sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she counted the missing workdays. Harrow's statement claimed 60 remaining. But with the 9 false housing charges removed, the single medical charge corrected, and the false missed shift restored at minimum, Amos's remaining debt shrank by at least 27 days. That was just from Mabel's book. She was still working when Mabel came back in and stood in the doorway. "What did you find?" she asked. Willa showed her. She went through each date, what Harrow's book said and what Mabel's book said. Mabel sat down partway through and didn't get back up. When Willa finished, Mabel was quiet for a moment. "It's the same story with other men," she said finally. "Harris, Delgado, old Pete, with the bad knee." She pressed her lips together. "They all say the numbers don't come out right. Harrow tells them they miscounted." "Would any of them compare their accounts with each other?" "Not openly. They're afraid." "I understand." Willa gathered her papers carefully. "What about privately? Could you mention it? Not as an accusation. Just ask them to look." Mabel thought about that. "I can do that, and if they find the same errors, then they'll tell me." Mabel looked at her steadily. "And I'll tell you." Willa thanked her and left through the kitchen door. She walked 2 blocks to the company store on the main road, bought a small packet of paper, and stood outside in the cold for a moment while she decided what to do next. There was one more thing she needed. Rourke's freight records confirmed some of it. Mabel's book confirmed more. But the full picture required the mine's own shift log, and that was in Harrow's office, which she couldn't enter. What she could do was copy every number she had before Harrow found a reason to take it. She sat at the low bench outside the store and wrote out 2 complete copies of everything, every date, every discrepancy, every note. Her handwriting was small and fast. She had done this before in the back room of the Mercantile, copying records that someone wanted lost. She put 1 copy in her coat. The other she folded inside the paper packet and addressed it to herself at a post office in Denver she had used once years ago. She paid the postmaster for it before he could think about it. The copies existed now, and Harrow didn't know where they were. When Rourke came back with the wagon at midday, she climbed up and handed him her working notes. He read them while the horse walked the road back toward the ranch. 27 days, he said, at minimum, and that's without the original signed receipt. He was quiet. "Your freight records helped," she said. "Thank you for letting me use them." "Harrow closed the store to me this morning," he said. He said it plainly, without anger, the way you report weather. "I'll have to order supplies through the county now. Longer ride." She looked at him. "Because of me?" "Because of him." He folded the notes and handed them back. "There's a difference." She didn't know what to do with that, so she put it away for later. That evening, back at the ranch, she sat across from Rourke at the table again and wrote out a clean master list of every false charge she'd found. He watched her work, and she could feel him doing what she did, not just watching the pen move, but thinking through what the numbers meant. Mabel said, "Other workers have the same errors," she said. "I believe it. If they'd share their accounts, even just the numbers, I could show a pattern." She set down her pen. "Harrow can argue 1 account is a misunderstanding. He can't argue 30. Rourke leaned back in his chair. "Once they start talking to each other, Harrow will know. He watches. I know he'll threaten evictions. I know that too." She met his eyes. "What's the alternative? Let him keep doing it." He didn't answer right away. Outside, the horses were quiet in the barn. The fire in the stove had burned down to coals. "You're going to keep going, regardless," he said. "Yes, then keep going." She turned back to her papers. She was still at the table an hour later when the smell reached her, sharp and hot and wrong. She stood up. Outside, the barn was lit from within. Orange light moved in the gaps between the boards. A sound like something breathing too fast. Fire. She was already running. Willa hit the barn door at a run and threw the bar up with both hands. The smoke came first, low and rolling, the gray kind that meant wet hay burning slow. She pulled her coat collar over her mouth and went in. The fire had started in the back left corner, near the feed bins. One of them was fully involved. The wall behind it was dark and blistering. The horses were at the far end, all four of them, packed into the last two stalls and screaming in a register that went straight through the chest. She went for the horses. She unlatched the first stall and got out of the way fast. The gelding bolted past her and through the open door. The second horse, a bay mare, was pressed into the corner with her head low and her eyes showing white all the way around. Willa grabbed the halter rope from the post, looped it quickly, and talked without thinking about what she was saying. Just sounds, low and even, until the mare's head came down an inch. Then she led her toward the door. The mare planted twice, pulled back once hard enough to burn Willa's palm through her glove. She held on. They were almost to the door when the loft beam cracked above them. Willa heard it before. She saw it a deep splitting sound, and then a rush of sparks coming down from above. The burning section of loft gave way, and a heavy joist dropped sideways. She pulled the mare left and pushed hard against her shoulder to move her clear, and the timber came down into the stall they had just left. They made it out. Willa released the mare into the corral yard and turned back. Rourke was in the barn. She had not seen him go in. She called out. No answer. She went back through the door. He was on the ground in the smoke near the third stall. One hand braced on the post, trying to get up. A section of the fallen beam had caught his shoulder on the way down. The two horses from the last stalls were loose and moving behind him, spooked and circling. She got to him fast. She ducked under his arm and took his weight on her shoulders, and they moved. She steered him toward the open door, and when they came through, she kept him upright until they reached the fence rail and could stop. He leaned against the rail, breathing. The horses were loose in the yard. 3 of them were already at the far fence, calm enough now that they were outside. The mare Willa had led out was walking a slow circle near the water trough. The barn burned. They stood and watched it for a while. There was nothing else to do. The fire had taken the back corner and the left wall, and a good portion of the hay stored along the inside. The structure would survive. The main beams were thick, and the fire hadn't reached the roof, but the winter feed was gone. Most of it. Rourke picked up something from the mud near the fence post. He turned it over in his hands. A lantern. The base was stamped with a small H inside a circle. Company property. He held it for a long moment. Then he set it down carefully, like he was placing it somewhere he'd remember. Harrow, Willa said. He didn't deny it. Then we need to report this. Report it to who? His voice was even. Harrow owns most of this county's business relationships. The nearest marshal is 2 days' ride. That doesn't make it acceptable. No. He straightened up off the rail. His left shoulder sat lower than his right. It doesn't. She watched him. There was something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not anger. Exactly. More like something old and tired being asked to stand up again. Why won't you accuse him publicly? She asked. He was quiet. Hollis. It was the first time she'd used his name. It came out before she'd considered it. You know what he did. You have a company lantern from inside your own burning barn. You've known for years that he falsifies accounts. Why won't you say any of it out loud? He turned away from the barn and looked at the mountains above the ridge. My brother worked the mine, he said. Emmett. He was 22. She waited. 12 years ago, part of a tunnel collapsed. I was on the surface. I could hear them inside. You could hear them if you stood close to the rock. 5 men, still alive. He paused. I went to Harrow, told him they needed to stop production and go in after them, and he refused. He said the tunnel section was unstable, and any rescue would risk the other workers. He said he'd make a decision by morning. Rourke turned back to her. His face was the same as always, careful still, but his voice had gone flat in a different way. Morning was too long, I said so. He told me my mother lived in company housing, that if I made any trouble, she'd be out before the week was over. She had no one else. Willa didn't say anything. So I waited. He looked at the burned lantern, in the mud. Emmett died with 4 others before dawn. Harrow put it in his report as a structural failure caused by worker error. The fire in the barn crackled and shifted. A section of the feed wall came down and sent a column of sparks up into the night sky. "I'm sorry," she said. "About Emmett?" He nodded. "But Hollis." She kept her voice even. "That was 12 years ago. Your mother? Is she still in company housing?" "She died 4 years back." "Then what's stopping you now?" He looked at her. "I know why you stayed quiet then," she said. "I understand it. You were protecting someone who needed protecting. But there's no one left to protect by staying quiet. Every month you don't say anything is another month." Harrow can tell his version. "Another month, those 4 other families have to live with a lie about how their men died." He turned away again and was quiet for a long time. "I'm not the person you need me to be," he said. "You stepped out of a freight wagon and said one word to Blaine Harrow in front of 30 workers, she said. "You are absolutely the person." He didn't answer. They stood there until the fire burned itself down to a manageable glow. Then Rourke went for the water buckets and spent the next hour making sure the remaining structure wouldn't reignite. Willa worked beside him without being asked, filling, carrying, passing, while he directed the water at the hot spots along the base of the walls. They didn't talk during it. There was nothing left to say that wasn't already out between them. When the last bucket was empty and the smoke had gone gray and thin, they settled the horses back into the salvage stalls and came inside. Rourke's shoulder had stiffened up badly. He moved his arm in a slow circle and said nothing about it. Willa put more wood on the stove and heated water. She handed him a cloth soaked in hot water without asking permission, and he held it to his shoulder without arguing about it. They sat at the table, both of them still smelling of smoke, and neither of them spoke for a while. "The lantern," she said finally. "I know. I need you to keep it. Don't throw it away. If it comes to a formal proceeding, that lantern is evidence." He looked at her across the table. "You're already thinking about a formal proceeding." "I've been thinking about it since I read Amos's statement." She pulled her working notes from inside her coat. They smelled like smoke now, too, but the ink was intact. "I have 2 copies of everything I found. One went out with the postmaster this morning." He looked at the papers. Something shifted in his expression. "You knew he'd come after the evidence," he said. "I assumed he'd try." She smoothed the papers flat. "It's what I would do if I were him." He sat with that for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up and was moving through the pine trees along the ridge with a sound like distant water. "I have a written record," he said quietly, "from the night Emmett died. I wrote down the time I reported the collapse, the time Harrow told me to wait, and the time I heard the last of them stop. I kept it. Where? Inside the freight ledger, between the last page and the back cover." She kept her face steady. "That's evidence, Hollis. That could be the most important piece of evidence anyone has." "I know what it is." His jaw was tight. I've been living with it for 12 years. "I know." She met his eyes, "and I'm asking you to let it do some good." He didn't agree that night. He didn't disagree either. He got up, checked the horses one more time, came back and sat down, and she went back to her notes and let him sit with it in peace. It was past midnight when she went to check on Amos. He was awake. He heard her come in and turned his head. "I smelled the smoke," he said. "Barn fire. We got the horses out." "All of them?" "All of them." He relaxed back into the pillow. His free hand moved to the empty watch chain at his bedpost, touching it the way someone touches a bruise without meaning to. "Papa," she said, "the receipt that's inside the watch. Did you tell anyone else about it?" He was quiet for a moment. "Truett Shaw signed it," he said. "He knows it exists. Whether he'd say so out loud is a different question. I'll find out." He reached over and caught her wrist before she could stand. "The marks were only half the proof," he said. "The paid receipt was hidden beneath the watch lining." She covered his hand with hers. "I know. We'll get it back." She sat with him until his eyes closed and his breathing eased out into sleep. Then she went to her bedroll near the stove and lay down in the dark. She stared at the ceiling for a long time. Trust was a thing you built from small pieces. A cup of water set down without ceremony. A door left open so a person could leave. A man who told you the worst thing he'd ever done and didn't ask you to call it something smaller than it was. She was angry at Hollis for his 12 years of silence. She was also certain he'd already been angrier at himself than she could manage. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow there was still a lot of work to do. The snow started before sunrise. Willa heard it first as quiet a sudden absence of wind that meant weather moving in. Then the light coming through the curtain changed, going from gray to a flat white that meant accumulation. By the time she had the stove rebuilt and coffee on, there were 2 inches on the porch rail, and more coming. Rourke was already in the barn when she came out. He had rigged a section of canvas over the gap where the burned wall had let in the cold, tied it off at the top loft beam with 3 lengths of rope. It wasn't a permanent repair, but it would hold for a few days. He was moving hay from the small reserve pile to the horses' mangers when she arrived. "I'll take that side," she said, and picked up the second fork without waiting for his answer. They worked down the line of stalls without talking. Outside, the snow came down steadily, the fat, early season that stacked up fast and made everything soft and muffled. When they finished with the hay, Rourke checked each horse in turn, running a hand down their legs and looking at their hooves. The mare Willa had let out the night before got a little extra attention. She pressed her nose against his shoulder, and he let her. "I want to apologize," he said. Willa set down the fork. "For what specifically? For expecting you to leave. Before you understood why you were staying." He kept his hand on the mare's neck. "I didn't ask. I just assumed a woman who was scared enough would take the easier road. I'm not scared. I know that now." She looked at him a moment. Apology accepted. They went inside and sat at the table. Willa spread her notes. Rourke set out bread and cold meat without discussing it, and she ate on one side of the papers, while he read through her new entries from Mabel's logbook. "You want to tell me something," she said. "Several things." He looked up. "But you first." She set down her bread. "I lost my job before I came here. The mercantile position." She kept her voice flat. "I found that the manager's nephew was stealing from customer accounts. I said so. The manager kept his nephew and removed me." Rourke looked at her steadily. "Did you know before you spoke up that that would happen?" "I suspected it. And you said it anyway. What was the alternative?" He was quiet for a moment. "You haven't told Amos?" "He'd blame himself for calling me back to another mining town. He'd think he ruined my future." She folded the edge of one paper over. "He didn't ruin anything. He just needed me. There's a difference between needing someone and becoming the reason they stop living their own life." She looked up at him. "I'm not saying Amos is doing it deliberately," he said. "I'm saying it can happen without anyone meaning it to." She didn't answer. "Not because he was wrong." "What were you going to tell me?" she asked. He got up and went to the freight ledger on the desk. He came back and opened it to the last page, lifted the back cover, and took out a folded piece of paper. He set it on the table between them. She opened it carefully. The handwriting was younger than his current hand, looser, less certain, but the entries were precise. Time, location, what was said, what was decided, what happened after. It covered a single night 12 years ago. The last line read, "Last sound at 4:14 in the morning." After that, nothing. She closed it gently. "This is important," she said. "I know, Hollis. This establishes that Harrow knew men were alive in there and chose production over their lives. That's not a failed rescue. That's a decision." "Yes." She looked at him. "Are you ready to say that out loud?" He met her eyes. "I'm getting there." She folded the paper and slid it back to him. He put it in his vest pocket. Outside, the snow was still coming down. Amos's voice came from the bedroom. He was awake and calling, not in distress, just talking, and they both recognized it. Rourke got up and put a fresh cup of coffee near the bedroom door without going in, and Willa went to sit with her father. Amos looked better. There was color in his face for the first time, and his eyes were clear. He had managed to sit up against the headboard on his own. "Snow," he said, looking at the white light through the window. "Good few inches already. Early this year, He reached for the coffee. Truett Shaw signed my receipt. He said it without preamble, the way he'd been thinking it through while she was in the other room. I don't know if he's brave enough to say so, but you should find him before Harrow does. How do I find him? He takes his supper at the company boarding house on Thursdays. He pays separately from the miners he's foreman, so he gets a different account. Mabel will know where he sits. Willa added it to her notes. Mabel arrived mid-morning, before the snow got heavy enough to stop travel. She came on foot with a shawl pulled tight and 3 folded papers tucked inside her coat. She sat down, spread the papers on the table, and looked at Willa and Rourke both. "I talked to 6 men last night," she said, quietly. "Just asked them to pull their statements and look at a few dates." She pressed one paper flat. "Every one of them has duplicate charges. 2 of them have shifts removed from their accounts the same way as Amos days that show on my meal records as underground overnight shifts." Willa read through the entries. The pattern was identical. Housing charges on nights the men were underground. Medical fees appearing twice under different dates. "He's been doing this to all of them," she said. "For years." Mabel's voice was even, but her hands pressed flat on the table, like she needed to hold something down. "Harris has been in Red Hollow for 4 years. He should have worked off his original debt in 18 months. Harrow keeps adding." Rourke looked at the papers. "If they all compare accounts, Harrow will know within a day." "He already suspects," Mabel said. "He sent a notice to the boarding house this morning. Anyone sharing account records with Willa Hartwell will be subject to immediate eviction review." Willa kept reading. "Then we need to work faster," she said. She spent the next 2 hours making clean copies. Rourke organized them by date and worker. Mabel sat at the far end of the table and wrote out a short statement describing her record-keeping system, how she logged every meal, every lodging night, every separate charge, so that a person unfamiliar with the books would understand how to read them. The evidence was growing. The picture was getting clearer. At one point, Willa looked up and found Rourke watching her. "Not the papers. Her." She held his gaze for a moment, then looked back at her work. The afternoon came on slow and gray. Mabel left before the snow peaked. Rourke went out to check the horses and reinforce the canvas patch over the barn wall. Willa finished the last clean copy and leaned back in her chair. She had been thinking about the receipt all day, about Truett Shaw, about the fact that even with everything she'd gathered, Harrow could still call it conjecture, a bunch of workers misreading their own accounts. A bookkeeper, with a grudge. The receipt changed that. A signed document, confirmed by the man who signed it, showing the debt was paid in full. That was a different argument entirely. She heard Rourke come back inside, stomp the snow off his boots. He hung his coat and came to the table. "I need to talk to Truett Shaw," she said. "Risky. Everything about this is risky." She looked at the snow outside the window. "Thursday, he's at the boarding house. I'll go to Mabel and ask her to set up a quiet meeting." He sat down. "I'll come with you. You don't have to. I know." He looked at the papers. "But I'm going to." She nodded. The fire in the stove settled. The snow came down outside, steady and soft, covering the burned section of barn wall, covering the corral fence, covering the road between Red Hollow and the rest of the world. Willa looked at her hands on the table. She thought about the receipt, about Amos counting his days in the dark, about Emmett Rourke, 22 years old, waiting for someone to come through the rock. "Thank you," she said, "for the freight records, for the lantern, for staying." Rourke looked at her. "It's my town, too." She understood what he meant. Not just geographically. He'd let Harrow have it for 12 years. He was done with that. "We'll get the watch back," she said. Before he could answer, they heard a knock at the door. Fast, urgent, a little breathless. Rourke opened it. Dr. Price stood on the porch with snow on her shoulders and a look on her face that meant bad news had arrived ahead of schedule. "Harrow filed a notice this afternoon," she said. "He's declaring Amos in breach of contract. He's sent for his guards." She stepped inside and shook the snow from her shawl. "They're coming at sunrise." Willa was already standing. Then we have tonight, she said. They moved Amos before midnight. Rourke packed a bedroll and extra blankets into the wagon bed and lined it with hay from the surviving feed pile. Dr. Price had given them a bottle of medicine for the cough and instructions about keeping him warm and upright if the breathing got bad. Amos protested twice on principle and then accepted it. Mabel had a back room at the boarding house, behind the kitchen where she stored extra cots and winter linens. Nobody from the mine crew used it. It had one small window that faced the alley, and Mabel kept the kitchen fire banked high enough that the heat carried through the wall. She met them at the alley door without a lantern. They got Amos inside and settled before the snow started again. Rourke stayed to help Mabel secure the outer doors. Willa sat with her father until his eyes closed. Then she went to the kitchen table and spread her notes one more time, reading through everything by the light of the low stove fire. She was still reading when Rourke came in and sat across from her. "Guards will check the ranch first at sunrise," he said quietly. "When they don't find him there, they'll search town. How long does that buy us?" "A few hours. Depends on whether Harrow is up early." She looked at her papers. "It's enough time to make some decisions." In the morning, Harrow came himself. He didn't come to the boarding house. He came to the ranch, found it empty of patients, and apparently made a few inquiries. By mid-morning, he arrived at the boarding house front door with 2 guards and his pleasant expression, and asked Mabel if she was harboring a contract laborer. Mabel said she ran a boarding house and had paying guests. Harrow said he'd like to speak with Willa Hartwell. Mabel brought the message to the kitchen. Willa folded her notes, put them in her coat, and went out to the front room. Harrow stood near the door. His hat was dry, which meant he'd arrived by covered buggy. He looked at her the way he had in the mine yard measuring, categorizing. "I have a proposal," he said. She waited. "There are 2 seats on the Thursday stagecoach. Last one before the heavy snow closes the road." He folded his hands in front of him like a man discussing a reasonable business arrangement. "I'll release your father from all remaining labor obligations. You both go home. Whatever records you've gathered, stay here." She looked at him. "You're offering to free my father," she said, "in exchange for me leaving and taking the evidence with me." "I'm offering a clean resolution." She watched his face. He was good at this. The reasonable tone, the patient expression, the sense that he was doing her a favor. She had seen it from store managers and account supervisors her whole working life. Men who believed that if they stayed calm enough, you would eventually believe their version of events over your own eyes. "I appreciate the offer," she said. "No." Something shifted in his expression. "Just slightly, Miss Hartwell. Your father is a sick man. The road closes in 4 days. If you're still here after that, this becomes considerably more complicated for both of you." "Then we'd better work quickly," she said. He studied her for a moment. Then he put his hat back on, nodded to the guards, and left. She stood at the window and watched the buggy go. Her hands were steady. She noted that and filed it away. Rourke arrived an hour later. He had ridden from the ranch and came through the alley. He found her in the kitchen, and she told him what had happened. He listened. Then he said, "You should consider it." She looked at him. "The stagecoach option," he said. "Amos gets out. You get out. Whatever Harrow does after that, at least he's not doing it to your father. Harrow's promise isn't worth the air it took to say it." He'd find another reason to pull Amos back in before the buggy reached the county road. She pulled her coat tighter, and even if he didn't, there are 30 other men in that mine, with the same false charges, with the same trap around them. Rourke said nothing. "I know you're trying to weigh what I might lose," she said. "I'm not asking you to stop caring about that. But I need you to hear me when I tell you that leaving is not the safer choice. It just feels like it." He was quiet for a long moment. "The choice is yours," he said. "It always was." She nodded. "Then here's what I need," she said. "Dr. Price has to get copies of everything to the county seat before the road closes. All of it, the false accounts, your testimony about Emmett, the boarding house records, and a written request for the county marshal to investigate Harrow's labor contracts. Rourke sat down. That's 2 days' ride. Roads will be rough. She's made that ride before. Willa was already writing. I'll ask her. She wrote for an hour. Rourke helped her organize the packet, every copy to count entry. Mabel's signed statement about the meal records, Rourke's written account of the night Emmett died. She added a cover letter addressed to the county marshal, stating the nature of the fraud, the names of the workers affected, and the fact that Amos Hartwell was being held under a falsified labor agreement. She kept one full copy of everything for herself. Dr. Price arrived at noon. Willa laid out what she was asking. Dr. Price looked at the packet. If I leave today, I can get ahead of the worst snow. I know I'm asking a lot. You're asking me to do what I should have done 6 months ago. She picked up the packet and tucked it under her arm. I'll go. She left within the hour. Willa stood at the kitchen window and watched her go, and she let herself feel the weight of that one thing going right. They hid Amos through the afternoon. Mabel brought him meals and talked to him about small things the garden she'd kept before her husband died. The summer, the creek flooded the lower road. Amos listened and contributed, and Willa could hear from the other room that his voice was steadier than it had been 2 days ago. Thursday came. Rourke and Willa went separately to the boarding house dining room that evening. Mabel pointed out Truett Shaw, without looking directly at him, a broad man in his 40s, with a foreman's calloused hands and the look of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time. He sat at the end table. He ate slowly. Willa sat 2 tables away, ordered coffee, and waited until most of the room had cleared. Then she moved to his table. He looked up. He knew who she was. I have 5 minutes, she said. Then I'll leave you alone. He didn't tell her to go. She took that as permission. I know you signed a receipt confirming that Amos Hartwell's original debt was paid in full, she said. I know Harrow asked for it back and that Amos kept it. I know it's inside the watch that Harrow now has. She folded her hands on the table. I'm not asking you to walk into the mine yard and make a speech. I'm asking you to tell me privately that the signature is yours and that the receipt was genuine. Truett looked at his coffee cup. If I do that, he said slowly, Harrow will know I talked. Eventually. Yes. He'll evict my sister. She has 3 children. She has nowhere else. I understand. Willa kept her voice level. I'm not going to tell you that protecting your sister is the wrong priority. It isn't, but I want you to understand something. She leaned forward slightly. The only reason Harrow can threaten your sister is because workers in this settlement don't compare notes. The moment 30 families stand together and say no, at the same time eviction stops being a workable threat. He cannot put 30 families in the snow. Truett was quiet. I signed the receipt, he said finally, very quietly. And was it genuine? Was Amos's original debt fully paid? A pause that lasted long enough that she almost asked again. Yes, he said. It was paid. Harrow told me afterward to alter the company book. Said there had been accounting errors. He looked up at her, and his eyes were tired, in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. I knew they weren't errors. Will you testify to that? He looked away. I don't know. She stood up. That's honest. I'll take honest. She pulled her coat on. When you decide, you know where to find me. She walked out into the cold. Rourke fell in beside her on the boarding house steps. He had been near the door. He had heard enough. He admitted it, she said. I heard. They walked toward the alley. The snow was coming down again, finer now, more like cold dust than flakes. She was about to say something else when they heard the mine bell. Both of them stopped. One long ring, then another. Then a pattern she didn't recognize, but the hour was wrong for a shift change. Too late, too urgent. Rourke's face changed. They went back through the alley at a run. Mabel was in the kitchen doorway. Her face was pale. Harrow's men found the room, she said. Amos went with them, he said. She pressed her lips together. He said he didn't want them to take it out on me. Willa stood in the kitchen doorway and held very still. Then she said, where did they take him? The mine. They're putting him on an overnight shift. She turned around. Rourke was already there. He said nothing. He just looked at her, waiting. "We're getting him out," she said. He nodded. "Tonight," she added. He nodded again. They went back to the ranch for supplies. Rourke moved fast and quiet through the dark house lanterns, rope, the short-handled pick he kept for trail work, 2 heavy coats. Willa went to the desk and pulled out her remaining copies of the evidence. She wrapped them in oilcloth and tucked them inside her traveling bag. She left the bag under the floorboard in Rourke's bedroom. If Harrow searched the ranch, it would take him time to find it. They stood in the main room. "There's an abandoned supply entrance on the northeast side of the mine," Rourke said. "Old mule passage from before they expanded. They boarded it up 4 years ago, but 2 of the planks are rotten. I know because I delivered timber for the repair, and the foreman only used half of what he ordered. How long to get there without being seen? An hour on foot. Less if the snow holds off. Then we go on foot." He looked at her. "Willa, I know the mine. You've never been inside. I know the emergency bell system." She held his gaze. "Amos repaired it when he first arrived. He explained the whole layout to me because he was proud that they'd trusted him with it. I know where the rope runs, how the signal works, and which passage the bell connects to." She pulled her coat on, "and I can identify the account office, which is where Harrow keeps his records, and possibly the watch." He studied her. "You're going to come regardless," he said. "Yes, then we go together." They went out into the dark. The snow had stopped, and the sky had cleared, which was both good and bad. Good because they could see the road. Bad because anyone watching from the mine yard could see the hillside clearly in the moonlight. They went up through the trees. It took 50 minutes on the back trail. Rourke knew every part of it, where the ground dropped away, where the roots were, where the old logging path crossed the mine access road. He moved through it without hesitating. She kept up without asking him to slow down. They didn't talk much on the way up. "Halfway there," she said, "what made you come out of the wagon that first day, when you said enough?" He was quiet for a moment, walking. "I knew him," he said. "Amos, from deliveries. He was always straight with me. Signed for exactly what arrived. Never padded his numbers." Another few steps, and I'd watched Harrow do this long enough. I was tired of being a man who watches. She kept walking. At the mule entrance, Rourke pulled 2 boards away from the lower section with his hands. They came off without much resistance, the wood punky and soft. The opening was low. They went through on hands and knees and came up inside into darkness and the smell of old rock and lamp oil. Rourke lit the lantern low, just enough to see 5 feet ahead. They moved through the passage. It was narrow and cut low, built for pack animals rather than people. Willa stayed close behind him. The floor was rocky and uneven. Water seeped along one wall in a thin, dark line. They had been moving for about 10 minutes when she heard voices ahead. Rourke stopped, raised his hand. She stopped beside him and listened. 2 guards talking. Somewhere around the next turn. Rourke leaned close and spoke directly into her ear. "Office passage branches left at the next junction. I'll go right toward the work area. Find the watch if you can. Don't take unnecessary risks." She nodded. He gave her the smaller lantern. She took it. They split at the junction. She went left. Passage widened slightly after 20 feet, and the smell of paper and lamp oil replaced the raw rock smell. She found the account office, a low room cut into the side wall, with a door that latched from outside. She lifted the latch and went in. Filing, boxes, a desk, a lantern on a hook that she lit from her own. She went to the desk first. The middle drawer was locked. The right drawer wasn't. She pulled it and found ledger books, loose paper, and a small tin box. She opened the tin. The watch was inside. She picked it up, turned it over, opened the case. The tally marks were all there, exactly as Amos had made them, 100 small scratches in neat rows. She pressed the inner lining gently with her thumbnail and felt the edge of a fold. The receipt was still there. She put the watch in her coat pocket and closed the tin and put it back exactly where she'd found it. She left the ledger books. She had what she needed. On the way back through the passage, she could hear, from the right branch, the sound of voices, more of them now, and one of them was Rourke's. She moved faster. She came around the turn and found them. Rourke was standing in the middle of the passage with his hands loose at his sides. In front of him, 3 workers were sitting against the wall, with their hands bound at the wrists with rope. One of them was Amos. He was conscious, and when he saw Willa, his eyes closed for a moment, in something that wasn't quite relief, and wasn't quite fear. A 4th man, Truett Shaw, of all people, was standing behind Rourke. He had a ring of keys in his hand and an expression on his face, like a man who had finally chosen a door and was no longer sure it was the right one. Truett let them out of the equipment room, Rourke said. There are 11 men. Some of them can't walk fast. Willa looked at Truett. You came? I couldn't, he stopped. My sister. I thought of my sister's children. He looked at the keys in his hand, and then I thought about Amos's face in the yard, and I came. She understood. She didn't say that now wasn't the time for explanation. She just nodded. She was about to speak again when the air changed. A deep, concussive thud from somewhere behind them, then a sound like rain, but from above, and much heavier. Dust fell from the ceiling in curtains. Rourke grabbed her arm. Main entrance, he said. He's blocked it. From somewhere ahead, Harrow's voice, flat and controlled and carrying through the rock, anyone who wants to see daylight can come out when I say so. Willa held the lantern up. 11 men, Rourke, Truett, Amos, leaning against the wall, breathing carefully. She reached into her coat and felt the watch under her fingers. Solid, present. Listen to me, she said, loud enough for all of them. I know where the emergency bell is. There's a side exit on the old passage that connects to it. We are going to go there in order, and we are going to get out. Nobody argued. She looked at Rourke. He looked back at her. You're sure about the bell? He said. My father taught me himself, she said. He nodded once. She turned and led them into the dark. The dust settled slow. It came down in sheets, then in drifts, then in a fine gray powder that coated everything, and turned the lantern light amber. Willa kept moving, and the men kept moving behind her, because stopping was the one thing none of them could afford. She counted them as she walked. 11 workers, Rourke, Truett. Amos at the back, one hand on the wall, moving carefully. 12 steps ahead, she found the first junction and turned left. The passage narrowed. 2 of the larger miners had to angle their shoulders to fit through. One man, she didn't know his name yet, was limping badly on his right leg. Rourke dropped back without being asked and got under the man's arm and kept him moving. Willa held the lantern high. The emergency bell rope had been strung along the upper left wall of the old mule passage, according to Amos. He had re-threaded it himself after the original line frayed. It connected to a cast iron bell, mounted outside the older side entrance, the entrance they'd sealed when the main shaft was expanded. The rope ran the full length of the passage and ended at a wooden toggle handle near the floor of the sealed door. She just had to find the handle before the air ran out. Behind her, she heard panic beginning. A young worker, maybe 19, had stopped walking and was pressing his back against the wall, breathing fast and shallow. Hey, she turned and kept her voice steady. What's your name? He looked at her. Peters. Peters, I need you to walk, just walk. Don't think past the next 10 steps. She held up the lantern so he could see her face clearly. Can you do 10 steps? He pushed off the wall and walked. She turned back and kept going. The air was getting heavier. Not unbreathable yet, but thick. 2 of the miners were coughing. Amos was breathing in short, controlled intervals, the way Dr. Price had shown him. Then she heard it. Harrow's voice again, closer this time, coming from a side shaft above them. He was using a passage she hadn't known about. There's no way out, he said. The rock carried his voice strangely, flattening it. Come back to the main shaft and we discuss terms. Nobody answered him. Rourke passed the limping man to Truett and came forward to walk beside Willa. He's trying to find us, she said quietly. How far to the bell? I don't know exactly, Amos said. The passage runs about 300 feet before it ends at the old door. We've done maybe half that." She nodded and kept walking. Another 50 feet, and the passage bent sharply right. She went around the corner and nearly missed it, the toggle handle, wooden and dark, hanging 3 inches off the floor on a rusted hook. The rope above it was intact. Old, but intact. She grabbed it and pulled. Nothing. She pulled again. Harder, hand over hand on the rope. A grinding sound from somewhere above. Then a pause, then distant, muffled by rock and snow, but real and carrying a metal ring. Once. Twice. Irregular at first as she worked out the pattern. "Keep pulling," Rourke said. She kept pulling. She established a rhythm. Short, short, long. The signal Amos had described. The pattern that meant people were alive and needed the old entrance cleared. She pulled until her arms ached, and then kept pulling. Around her, the men waited. Some sat down on the passage floor. Peters had stopped hyperventilating and was watching her work the rope with something close to focus in his eyes. Giving him something to observe had helped him as much as the walking had. Amos made his way to the front of the group and sat against the wall near her. "That's right," he said. "Exactly right." She kept the rhythm. Then Truett spoke from the back of the group. "Harrow's coming down through the south branch. I can hear him." Rourke was already moving. "I'll handle it." "Don't hurt him," Willa said without stopping the rope. Rourke looked back at her. "We need him alive and unharmed," she said. "If he's injured, everything becomes complicated." He understood. He went. Harrow appeared at the mouth of the south branch 2 minutes later with 1 guard. He stopped when he saw the group. He saw the rope in Willa's hands. He saw Truett standing among the workers. His expression, for the first time, went past pleasant. "Truett," he said. Truett looked at him. "I'm done," he said. It came out simply, like a man setting down something he'd carried too long. Harrow moved toward Willa. Rourke stepped into his path. "The bell," Harrow said. "Stop ringing it." "No," she said, and kept pulling. Harrow reached into his coat. His guard moved. Rourke moved faster. He stepped into the guard, took his arm at the wrist, and redirected him into the passage wall with one controlled motion. No strike. Just physics. The guard sat down hard. Harrow lunged for the rope. Willa let it go with one hand and turned her body. He grabbed the rope above her hand and pulled upward to slack it. She pulled down. They were close enough that she could see his expression clearly, not rage. Just the flat determination of a man who believed he was always the strongest person in any room. She dropped her weight low and yanked the rope sideways. His grip broke. The watch slipped out of her coat pocket in the movement and hit the passage floor. Harrow saw it. He grabbed for it. His fingers closed on it for 1 second. Rourke's boot came down over his wrist, flat, firm, not crushing, just pinning. Harrow released the watch. Willa picked it up. She put it back in her pocket and went back to the rope. Short, short, long. Short, short, long. Nobody spoke for a while. Harrow sat in the passage with his back against the wall. Rourke stood 3 feet away and watched him. The guard stayed seated. Truett organized the workers into a rough line facing the sealed door. Then, from outside, muffled but real, the sound of digging, wood being pried, snow being moved, voices. The old door shuddered. One of the miners put his shoulder against it, then 2 more. Then Rourke was beside them, and they hit it together, and it swung outward with a rush of cold air that hit Willa like water. The workers went through first. Truett helped the limping man. Peters went through at a run and then stopped just outside and stood in the snow and breathed, like it was something he'd forgotten how to do. Rourke came back and picked Amos up from where he'd slid down the wall, not unconscious, but close. He carried him through the door. Willa went through last. The night outside was clear and bright. Full moon on fresh snow. The mine families were there, wives, older children, Mabel in the front with a lantern in each hand. Someone had brought blankets. Someone else had built a fire in the yard. Harrow came through the door with his guard. He looked at the assembled crowd and seemed to recalculate. Willa watched him do it. She put her hand in her coat pocket and felt the watch. Amos was on the ground near the fire, with someone's coat over him. His eyes were closed. His breathing was shallow but present. Dr. Price's assistant, a young man named Calloway, was kneeling beside him with a kit bag open on the snow. Willa crouched next to her father. He opened his eyes. "Are we out?" he said. "We're out." He closed his eyes again. She stayed next to him until his breathing steadied. Then she stood up and turned around. The mine bell at the main entrance was still ringing somewhere. Someone had heard it from outside and pulled the yard bell as well. The sound carried down into the settlement. More people were coming up the road. Rourke stood beside her. His shoulder was bothering him again. She could see it in the way he held his arm, but he was watching the crowd come in, and his face was calm. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," he agreed. Morning came gray and cold and still. The mine yard filled slowly. Word had moved through Red Hollow, the way word moves in a small settlement through kitchen walls and over fence lines and via Mabel, who had spent the early hours going door to door with quiet urgency. By 9 o'clock, there were perhaps 60 people in the yard, workers and their families standing close together against the cold, watching the company office with the particular attention of people who had spent years pretending not to see something. Harrow was inside the office. 2 of his guards were with him, though they'd been standing with their arms at their sides since dawn. Calloway had looked after Amos through the night. By morning, Amos was sitting upright on a cot near the fire, wrapped in 2 blankets, his color better than it had been in days. He wasn't ready to stand, but his eyes were clear. Willa sat next to him and opened the watch. The inside lid was exactly as it had always been. 100 small marks in rows of 10, scratched with a careful hand. She pressed the inner lining gently at the corner and eased it away from the case. The folded paper underneath was thin as a leaf. She opened it. The handwriting was Truett Shaw's. She recognized it from the foreman's entries in the mine delivery records. Date, worker name, original debt amount, confirmation of payment in full. Signed at the bottom with Truett's full signature. Truett was standing 10 feet away, watching her read it. "That's your signature," she said. "Yes," he said. "And the debt was fully paid." "Yes," his voice was level. "The agreement was 100 days. Amos completed 100 days. I signed because he had earned it." He paused. "Harrow told me to get the receipt back. There had been accounting errors. I went to Amos and asked for it. He said he'd given it back already." "He hadn't. I know." She folded the receipt carefully and held it. She looked at the crowd in the yard. Mabel had the boarding house records under her arm. Rourke was standing near the office door, not blocking it, just present. Willa stood up. She raised her voice enough to carry across the yard without shouting. In her experience, if you shouted, you gave people something to react to instead of something to consider. "My name is Willa Hartwell. My father, Amos, has worked in this mine for 8 months. According to Harrow's company records, he still owes 60 days. According to this," she held up the receipt. "He paid every day he owed before the summer ended." The yard was quiet. "This receipt was signed by Truett Shaw, your mine foreman, on the day Amos completed his 100th shift." She turned to face the office door. After Amos earned this, Harrow altered the company book. He removed completed shifts. He added duplicate medical charges. He charged Amos for housing on nights. Amos was underground. Every single false entry is documented. She looked at Mabel. Mabel stepped forward and opened her boarding house ledger. She didn't speak loudly. She just held the book open so the workers nearest her could see the dates. Harris stepped forward first. Then Delgado, a broad man with a careful face who had been in Red Hollow for 4 years. He reached into his coat and pulled out his own company statement. He pointed at 3 entries and said, "To nobody in particular. I knew these were wrong. I've said so for 2 years." Harrow came out of the office. He came out with his coat buttoned and his expression managed. He looked at the crowd with the practiced patience of a man who expected to talk his way through rooms. "What you're seeing," he said, "is a woman with a grievance interpreting accounting records. She doesn't have the training to understand." "I was a professional bookkeeper for 6 years," Willa said. I identified altered entries in the first 30 minutes of reading your books. Company records are private. The ones you kept are certainly private. These are copies. She held up the folded papers. The originals went to the county seat 3 days ago. Something moved through the crowd. Not noise. A shift in posture. People standing a little straighter. Harrow looked at her, then at Truett. You signed a company document, he said to Truett. That document belongs to the company. I signed it as a witness to a debt being paid, Truett said. His voice wasn't loud either. It belongs to the man who paid. Harrow turned back to the crowd. I've provided every one of you with work, housing, medicine. I've kept this settlement alive through 2 hard winters. He spread his hands, reasonable and calm. One family's disagreement over an account doesn't change what I've built here. Rourke walked forward from the office door. He stopped in the middle of the yard and looked at Harrow for a moment. The whole yard looked at him. He wasn't a man who drew attention, usually too quiet, too still. But when he spoke, his voice carried clean across the cold air. 12 years ago, he said, part of the east tunnel collapsed. 5 men were alive inside. I reported it to Harrow and asked him to halt production and begin a rescue. The yard was very still. He refused. He said the tunnel was too unstable and the rescue would cost a full day of production. He told me that if I pressed it, my mother would lose her company housing. He kept his voice even. By morning, all 5 men were dead, including my brother Emmett. Nobody moved. Harrow's report called it a structural failure caused by worker error. Rourke looked directly at Harrow. It wasn't an error. It was a decision. And I have the written record of the time I reported those men alive. The time Harrow told me to wait, and the time they stopped. Truett spoke from across the yard. Harrow told me the accident was unavoidable. I believed him for years. He looked at the ground and then back up. The receipt I signed for Amos's debt, Harrow told me to mark it, returned, and re-enter the charges as outstanding. I did it because he threatened to evict my sister. He stopped. I knew it was wrong. I did it anyway. I'll answer for that, but I won't cover it anymore. Harrow looked at his guards. Remove these people from company property, he said. Neither guard moved. One of them, the younger one who had sat down in the mine passage the night before, took a slow step sideways. Away from Harrow, the noon bell rang. It was on the company clock. Automatic. It rang every day at noon to signal the shift change. And for years, the sound of it had meant men walking toward the mine entrance. Nobody moved. The bell rang 11 times and went quiet. The silence after it was different from the silence before. Harrow looked at the mine entrance, then at the yard full of people who were standing still. His jaw worked. Any family that refuses to honor their labor agreement, he said, will be evicted by end of week. Mabel Quinn stepped forward. She was not a tall woman. She had a boarding house ledger under one arm and a lantern in her other hand, and the expression of someone who had decided to stop being quiet about things. The families will share food and shelter before we let you put one of us in the snow, she said. Every house on this street has already agreed. Harrow looked at his 2 remaining guards. Arrest her, he said. Arrest Rourke. Arrest no, the older guard said. Harrow looked at him. No, the man said again. Flatly, I'm not arresting 60 people. For a long moment, Harrow stood in the yard with nobody behind him and nobody obeying him, and nowhere reasonable to go. Harris walked to the office door. Delgado followed. 3 other workers came from the other side of the yard. It was quiet and deliberate, no shouting, no rushing. They guided Harrow inside by presence rather than force. Someone found a key for the outer lock. Nobody touched him roughly. Nobody needed to. Willa stood in the middle of the yard with the watch in one hand and the receipt in the other, and looked at the mine entrance. Rourke came to stand beside her. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. You all right? He said. Yes. She thought about it for a moment. Yes, I am. From behind her, Amos's voice, she turned. He was sitting up on the cot, both blankets pulled around his shoulders, watching her across the yard. Do I owe him another day, he said. She walked to him. She crouched down in front of the cot and looked at her father's face, the thin cheeks, the clear eyes, the small smile at the corner of his mouth that told her he already knew the answer. "No," she said, "you don't owe him anything." He closed his eyes. His shoulders came down about an inch. Behind her, the mine yard was alive with voices, quiet and purposeful, people making plans instead of waiting to be told what to do. 6 weeks passed. The heavy snow came and went twice. The roads closed for 10 days and then opened again, muddy and rutted, but passable. Dr. Price came back from the county seat with cold feet and good news. She sat across from Willa at Rourke's kitchen table and told her what she'd found. The marshal reviewed. "Everything I brought," she said. He had questions. I answered them. He sent 2 deputies ahead and followed 3 days later with a court order. County Marshal Owen Kersey arrived on a Tuesday with 2 men and a leather satchel full of paperwork. He was a precise, deliberate man who asked questions in a particular order and wrote down the answers in a small notebook before asking the next one. He met with Willa first, then Rourke, then Truett, then Mabel, then a half-dozen workers who had compared their accounts and found the same false charges. At the end of the week, he formally arrested Blaine Harrow. He read the charges plainly, standing in the mine yard in the clear winter sunlight: falsifying labor accounts, unlawful imprisonment, assault, endangerment of workers, deliberate destruction of mine property to trap persons underground. Harrow said nothing. He was taken to the county seat in a covered wagon. His company assets were frozen, pending a court proceeding. A portion of them, the court order, specified how much would be set aside to repay stolen wages to the workers whose accounts had been falsified. The mine itself was closed. Not permanently. An independent safety team from Denver would conduct the investigation. The mine could not reopen until new ownership had been established, and a worker-elected safety committee had been formed and given actual authority over working conditions. Several of the workers said they'd wait and see. Some of them said they were leaving Red Hollow regardless. Harris said he wasn't going anywhere. He'd been in Red Hollow for 4 years, and he'd finally started to feel like it was his. Willa understood that. Truett appeared at the marshal's proceedings and gave his full statement. He answered every question. He confirmed the receipt, the altered books, the duplicate charges. He confirmed that he had obeyed Harrow's instructions because of the threat to his sister, and he said that was not a complete excuse, only an explanation. The marshal noted the cooperation in writing. Truett was not immediately charged. Whether that would change was still being decided by people in the county with more authority than anyone currently in Red Hollow. He understood that. He said so clearly. Rourke gave his statement about Emmett on a Thursday morning. He sat across from the marshal at Mabel's kitchen table and told the story the same way he'd told it in the mine yard plain, and in order, without softening it and without embellishment. The marshal read the written record from 12 years ago. He studied the dates. He asked 2 questions. The old accident report was formally reopened. It would take time. These things always did. But by the end of the 2nd week, the official record had been amended. The cause of the accident at the East Tunnel was reclassified from worker error to employer decision. Emmett Rourke's name was on the amended record. Mabel had a small memorial board in the boarding house hall. It had been there for years, with names written in ink. She took it down one afternoon and added the names of all 5 men from the East Tunnel collapse, including Emmett's. She rehung it that evening without making an announcement. Rourke saw it the next morning when he came to check on Amos. He stood in front of it for a while. Mabel came out of the kitchen and stood beside him. "I blamed you," she said, "for staying quiet. My husband died in that tunnel. I know. I understand now why you did." She looked at the board. "It doesn't erase what happened, but I understand it." She paused. "I'm sorry I didn't say so sooner." He looked at her. "Thank you, Mabel." She went back to the kitchen. He stood there a while longer. Then he put his hat on and went out into the cold. Amos improved steadily. By the end of the first week, he was sitting up without help and eating full meals. By the end of the second, he had moved out of Mabel's back room and into a small cabin at the edge of Rourke's property, low-ceilinged, south-facing, with a good stove and a workbench under the window. Someone had left a set of watchmaker's tools on the bench. Nobody admitted to it. Within 3 days, Amos had disassembled 2 watches from workers who'd been meaning to get them repaired for months. He worked slowly, resting between tasks, and he looked better doing it than he'd looked at any point since Willa arrived in Red Hollow. Dr. Price gave her assessment on a clear morning in December, standing in the cabin doorway with her bag on her arm. "His lungs are permanently damaged," she said. "There's no changing that. But if he stays out of mining dust and doesn't overexert himself, he could live comfortably for many more years." She looked at Amos at the workbench. "He'll need to take it seriously." "I will," Amos said, without looking up from the watch movement in his hands. Dr. Price looked at Willa. "He'll need looking after. He knows where I am," Willa said. A letter arrived from Denver at the end of the 3rd week. It was from a trading company with offices in 3 states. They had heard through a chain of people Willa could only partially trace that there was a bookkeeper in western Colorado who had successfully reconstructed falsified accounts across multiple workers and prepared a case detailed enough to support criminal charges. They were offering her a position in their Denver office, senior clerk, stable salary, start date in the spring. She read it twice, folded it, set it on the table. Rourke saw it there that evening when he came in from checking the horses. "What's that?" he said. She told him. He poured coffee and sat down. He was quiet for a moment. "Good offer?" he said. "Very good." He turned the cup in his hands. "Denver's a long way, 3 days by train." She sat down across from him. "If the passes are clear." He looked at the letter and then at her. He chose his next words with the kind of care she'd come to recognize in him, the pause. That meant he was making sure he said exactly what he meant. "I have a proposal," he said. "A different kind than Harrow's." She waited. "My freight accounts are a mess without you. You've said so yourself, twice." A small pause. "I'd like to offer you a paid partnership, managing the accounts, working with the route planning, handling contract negotiations with the county suppliers." He looked at her steadily. "The offer stands regardless of anything else between us. You could sleep at Mabel's and come to work at the ranch, and that would be a perfectly good arrangement." "But," she said, "but." He held her gaze. "I would like it very much if you stayed. Not for the accounts. For me." He set the cup down. "I'm not asking you to stay because you have nowhere to go. You have somewhere to go. I'm asking because I want you here. There's a difference." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Denver. The salary, the clean office, the city, the version of her life that looked like the one she'd had before Red Hollow, only better paid. She thought about what she actually wanted. "I'll write back to Denver," she said, and declined. Something in his face changed, very slightly. "And the partnership?" he said. Yes, she met his eyes. "And the other thing, too." He reached across the table. She put her hand in his. They sat like that for a while in the quiet kitchen. Outside, the winter sunlight was coming through the window at a low angle, laying a long rectangle of gold across the floor. "After a while," she said, "my father needs to know he didn't ruin my future by calling me here. He didn't, I know that. I need to say it to him clearly, then say it." The proposal came that evening. They walked to the cabin together after supper. Amos was at the workbench with a lamp pulled close, working on the movement of a small brass clock. Rourke stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and asked Amos Hartwell if he could marry his daughter in the spring. Amos looked at Willa. Willa looked back at him and nodded once. Amos looked at Rourke. "She doesn't need my permission." "No," Rourke said, "but I'd like your blessing anyway." Amos set down his tools. He studied Rourke for a long moment with the same patience he'd used to study watch movements for 30 years, looking for what was actually there, not what he hoped to find. "You'll let her work," he said. "She'll work because she wants to," Rourke said. "Same as me. You'll tell her the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. I'll do my best. Amos picked up his tools again. Then you have it. They stayed a while longer and talked about smaller things, the spring, the freight routes, whether the mine would ever reopen under decent management. Amos had opinions about all of it. When they stood to leave, Willa looked at the bench. The watch was there, Amos's silver watch, set apart from the other repairs. She picked it up. She had been thinking about it for days. She had learned enough from watching her father work these past weeks to attempt a simple movement repair. The mainspring was intact. The mechanism just needed cleaning and resetting. She'd done it 2 evenings ago at the kitchen table while Amos slept. She opened the case. The second hand moved. Small, steady, indifferent to everything that had happened. Just moving through its arc the way it had been built to do. She handed it to her father. He took it. He looked at the inside of the lid, the 100 marks, the rows of 10, the scratches he'd made alone in the dark at the end of each long day. His thumb moved across them once. "What day should I count now?" he said. She closed his fingers around the watch. "The first day you owe no one." He held it. The second hand kept moving. Outside the cabin window, the winter sunlight lay across the snow in long level lines. Rourke was on the port, waiting. She could see him through the glass, the worn leather vest, the weathered hat, the still and patient way he stood. She pulled on her coat. She kissed her father on the top of his head and went out the door. 2 horses were tied at the porch rail. Rourke held out his hand, and she took it. They mounted and rode out together across the snow toward the ranch, toward the spring they were already planning, toward the life they had each chosen clearly and without reservation. The watch ticked in Amos's hand. The second hand moved. For the first time in a long time, it was counting something worth counting. There's a moment near the end of this story that I keep coming back to. Amos Hartwell, a sick old man wrapped in blankets, holding a pocket watch he'd carried through 8 months of darkness. He opens the case, looks at the 100 little marks he scratched in there, one by one, and asks his daughter a question so simple it almost breaks you. "What day should I count now?" And Willa closes his fingers around the watch and says, "The first day you owe no one." That's the whole story, right there in 2 lines. Because this was never really about a corrupt mine owner or a falsified ledger or even a pocket watch. It was about what happens to people when someone convinces them that their freedom is always just a little bit further away. One more day, one more debt, one more thing they owe before they're allowed to live. Harrow didn't just steal wages. He stole time. He stole the belief that people had the right to stop, to leave, to choose something different. And the frightening thing is, he didn't need chains to do it. He only needed fear and the silence that fear produces. Hollis Rourke understood that silence better than anyone. He'd been living inside it for 12 years. He told himself he stayed quiet to protect people. And maybe that was true at the beginning. But somewhere along the way, his silence stopped protecting anyone and started protecting the very man who had taken his brother. That's the lesson Hollis had to learn the hard way, that doing nothing is still a decision. And sometimes the most damaging choice you ever make is the one you convince yourself wasn't really a choice at all. Willa's lesson ran the other direction. She arrived in Red Hollow believing that being a good daughter meant putting herself last. That love was measured by how much you were willing to sacrifice. She'd missed her mother's final days because she was working. She'd lost her job because she told the truth. She'd traveled to a mining settlement with almost nothing because her father sent a letter. And she'd been carrying all of that like it was her fault, like caring about her own future was the same thing as abandoning the people she loved. It isn't. That's what Red Hollow taught her. You can love someone completely and still have a life of your own. You can fight for your father and also deserve a future. You can accept help without surrendering your independence. These things are not in conflict, they only feel that way when someone has spent a long time making you believe you have to choose. And then there's what happened in that mine yard when the noon bell rang and nobody moved. 60 people standing still in the cold. No dramatic speech, no violence, just stillness. Because they had finally understood the one thing Harrow had worked so hard to prevent them from understanding, that his power existed only as long as they faced it alone. The moment they stopped doing that, the moment they looked sideways and saw someone else standing in the same position, the whole structure came apart. Fear is loud and convincing when it's aimed at one person. It becomes a great deal quieter when 30 families decide to stand in the same direction. That's the thing about injustice that operates through isolation. It depends on people not comparing notes. It depends on each person believing their situation is unique. Their debt is real. Their silence is the only thing protecting them. The truth, the simple, powerful truth, is that the accounting was always false. The debt was always manageable. The people were never as alone as they were made to feel. So if this story leaves you with anything, let it be this. Count your days. Honestly, don't let anyone rewrite what you've already earned. Speak up one turn earlier than fear tells you to. And when someone is standing in the mud and nobody is moving, be the person who steps forward. You don't need a speech. Sometimes one word is enough. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. All characters, events, and locations are entirely imaginary, and any resemblance to real persons or places is coincidental.